So aloha mai kako again. Mahalo for joining us today for our Pili, Ke Kanaka Indigenous Social Sciences Speaker Series. Here we have Dr. Devi Dee Mucina. I am Komokana Aquino. I am the coordinator for ʻāina Pilipili, the college's Native Hawaiian initiative. Our mission is to strengthen ʻea Hawaii in the social sciences through Hawaiian-centered teaching, learning, service, and scholarship, while we cultivate pilina, relations, and kuleana, responsibility, with our students, with the ʻāina, our land, and with communities to strengthen our lahui and Hawaii. So our Pili Ke Kanaka Indigenous Social Sciences Speaker Series features Native Hawaiian and Indigenous scholars, practitioners, and leaders on related social science topics, and connects and engages students, staff, faculty, and community with thought-provoking social science knowledge from Indigenous perspectives. Today, we have our moderator, Ashley Purcell, who is a PhD student in the Department of Political Science, who will be moderating today's session.
Mahalo nui loa to Kamakana for those opening words. My name is Alyssa Purcell, and it is my great joy to introduce our speaker today as an Indigenous Ubuntu from the Ngoni and Shona people of Southern Africa. Devi Dee Mucina has been the program director of Indigenous governance at the University of Victoria in British Columbia since 2019. Mucina received his PhD from the Ontario Institute for Studies and Education at the University of Toronto, and he earned his MA in Indigenous Governance and BA in Child and Youth Care from the University of Victoria. His research interests include Indigenous African philosophies, decolonizing Indigenous masculinities, Indigenous fathering and other fathering, and using Ubuntu oralities and disability studies to understand the social memory of Indigenous children. One of his projects investigates how Indigenous men's associations nurture men's relational health and decolonizing masculinities with a focus on Africa, Turtle Island, and Oceania. Mucina's other project uses an Indigenous intersectional theoretical framework in examining how the incarceration of family members impacts children. His book is entitled Ubuntu Relational Love, Decolonizing Black Masculinities, published by the University of Manitoba Press on October 18, 2019. So mahalo for sharing your knowledge with us today, Devi. There's a lot here that we, especially as Kanaka Maoli, can connect with, learn from, and just overall resonate with, because in this book, you communicate this Ubuntu philosophy of I am because you are, and Hawaiians, we have that too, you know, many of our chants, like e hina hanaya kamalama, they include this saying of iola oi, iola oe, meaning when you thrive, I thrive. And that just goes to show that we're all just so very deeply connected. So thank you for this book and for your presence here today. I'm so excited for today. So mahalo.
Mahalo, Sissy. And I wanted to sort of like acknowledge and say thank you so much, Sissy, for the welcome. I also wanted to thank my brother for hosting and always taking care of me when I come to visit. I also want to visit Sister Nono, who has been an inspiration for many years, and you know, my brother Tai, and also my sister Nolani. Like I feel so at home just hanging out with you all and talking and sharing. But I wanted to also just quickly start off by giving a proper greeting and acknowledging and saying, you know, I'm grateful to be a visitor on the, you know, the Kingdom of Hawaii, and speaking to you all from the territory of the Lekwungen speaking people. And my family works, plays, and lives on the territory of the Esquimalt, Songhees, Wet'suwet'en, and we're grateful visitors here. We've been taken care of and nurtured by the people here, and so we are really grateful. Salibunani. which is a Zulu greeting, a Ngoni greeting, I should say, which means we see you, implies at a deep spiritual level, I'm never alone, I'm always with my ancestors. And the response to that, as my sister will attest, is Yebo Salibonani, which is to say, yes, you are in agreement that you and your ancestors are those that have come, paved the way for us, that you are in agreement of your observation of us. I also would like to give you a quick greeting also from the Shona people in Zimbabwe. My mother's, my maternal side, we are part of the Shona people from the Makoni district. So on the eastern side of Zimbabwe, which is near the border again with Mozambique. There's something about me and the borders with my relations. And so from that context, you know, I'm Shona on my maternal side, but also on my father's side, we're part of the Ngoni folks that settled in Malawi. So, you know, I have both that identity of being Ngoni as well as Chewa. And again, I find a community there on the border of Mozambique and Malawi. So there's something about those relational boundaries. You know, some of them are falsely created by colonial encounters, but I wanted to start off by acknowledging that. And then to say that my daughter was really excited, Nandi, and my son, Kamalo, when they heard I was speaking to you. And they asked me if I had sung a song for you the last time I'd engaged, and I told them that no, I did not sing a song. And so Nandi specifically requested that I sing for you all, and that I make sure that as I'm speaking, I tell you some stories, and that I centered this conversation in a way that that she would be proud of. So here goes. I would like to start off by saying that kare kare vanhu vachiri kutaura nemhuka sekuru tsuro nesekuru gudo vakatanga kuona kuti yanga iri gore yenzara kwanga kusina chinhu chekudya. Saka vakati toite sei, zvikanzi endei kusango tinotsvaga zvinhu zvekudya. Pavakaenda ikoko vakashaya zvinhu zvese, kwanga kusina chinhu chese chekudya. Zvakakungoonawo vanga ari mashizha nezvimwe zvinhu zvanga zviri musango, asi kwanga kusina manhanga, chibage, zvinhu zvese zvinotapira zvanga zvaenda, mhuka dzese dzanga dzadyiwa, panga pasina chinhu. Zvakanzi manje nasekuru tsuro kugudo, kuna sekuru gudo, ko hama yangu, uri kuona kuti hapana chinhu apa, ngatiite sei, ngatinhongei zvimwe zvinhu zviri pasi apa, ndoziva kuti hazvisi kunaka. Saka zvetichaita, ngatitore zvinhu izvi toise sei, toisa mupoto. Papoto apo towinza huni, totanga moto. Mvura iye yakatanga kuibva, yakatanga kupisawo, toisa zvinhu zvese. Asi wakaona kuti mvura iye yatanga kupisa asi kupita zvakawanda, inini ndichakwira. Ndakwira mukati memvura yomwe, ndoda kuti undisiye kuti ndombondibikawo mbichana kuti mvura iyi yombonaka, kuti zvinhu zvese zviri imomo, mashizha ari imomo, kuti anyasa kunaka. Zvakatanga kupisisa, ndoda kuti undibatsire kuti nditsike ndisapiswa. Zvakanzi nasekuru gudo, alright, ngatiite izvozvo. Manje pavakakwira sekuru tsuro mukati momo, vakatanga kuimba chimbo ichi. Zvakanzi hama dzangu ndofa kana ndinde hemzoone kufa kwangu, kana ndinde hama dzangu ndofa kana ndinde hemzoone kufa kwangu, kana ndinde ko ndakadai ndini yani. Sekuru tsuro vakazoti manje, ko hama zvakupisa, ndibatsire kuti ndiburuke. Zvikanzi nasekuru gudo, alright, wabatsira sekuru gudo manje vakati ini ndakupindawo zvikanzi alright pindako abva wapinda zvikanzi tsuro mvura iri kupisa zvikanzi nesekuru tsuro haiwa haisi kupisa abva watora huni dzawo abva waise ipapapo sekuru gudo abva atanga kuchema wakundipisa zvikanzi haiwa hausi kupiswa sekuru gudo abva atanga kuchema zvikanzi hama dzangu ndofa kana ndinde uya muzoone kufa kwangu kana ndinde obva wafa sekuru gudo vakazodyiwa nevamwe vacho nesekuru tsuro ipapapa ndapedza kangano kangu. So let me see if I can adequately do translation. As Bibitek said, translation never quite captures the essence of what we're trying to do. That is our struggle. I also wanted to sort of prefix before I begin to translate that Yvonne Vera, our sister from Zimbabwe, also highlighted to us that our responsibility as storytellers, as writers, is not the same responsibilities of our past elders. For when they were writing, they were fighting to find space in the academic sphere of Western institutions so that we could have a voice. And so they were speaking and writing directly to challenge those colonial perceptions. And so I'm really grateful for the work that was laid and the foundations that was laid. For I've come now and I'm telling the story, and really the focus of the telling of our stories now has shifted. For me, I am no longer trying to justify the need for us to have a voice. I am now telling the stories of our people and of our community in ways that communicate that I'm speaking first and foremost to our community. And in my case, first and foremost to my children. And hopefully echoing the stories of my ancestors. So I wanted to prefix that. So the story that I told you is instructed by Nandi to tell you, it goes this way, is that Uncle Hare or Rabbit and Uncle Baboon, it was the year of starvation and there was nothing. There were no food, there were all the pumpkins, all the animals, everything had been, either destroyed by the droughts and the famine or had been consumed. And so there was nothing. And so, Uncle Rabbit turned to Baboon, Uncle Baboon, and said, what shall we do, my relative? How should we survive this? And so they said, look, Uncle Rabbit said, look, there's a few, wild plants and leaves that we could cook, but unfortunately, they're not tasty. There's nothing tasty about them. So Uncle Rabbit said, I have an idea. Why don't we bring all these things, we put them in a big pot. And what I will do is I will climb into that pot and then you will start the fire and bring firewood and you will cook it. And so then Uncle Baboon said, well, won't that burn you? And he said, no. What will happen is that when it becomes unbearable, right, I will let you know and I will climb out. And then at that point, you can climb in. And you can see, Uncle Baboon wasn't paying attention too carefully over here. And so Uncle Baboon said, that's a great idea. That'll definitely add flavor to all of our food. And so, Uncle Rabbit climbs in. And so he sings this song, which says, my relatives, I die. If I were to die, who will remember me? Come and see how I die. It is important that somebody remembers that I was here and somebody keeps a track of my life. And so he sings this song and then he says, please take me out. And so Uncle Baboon helps him out ever so gently and so caringly. And then Rabbit says, now it's your turn, Baboon. It's your turn, my friend. You climb in. And so Uncle Baboon climbs in. But when he climbs in, he gets scorched by the water and he begins to cry and says, the water is burning me. And Uncle Rabbit says, no, 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 it's not burning you. You're mistaken. I just came out of there. The water is fine. And he starts to add fire. And sure enough, the water starts to boil and Uncle Baboon gets completely cooked. And then I conclude to say, this is my story to you, and I end here. And generally, what we would say is that I hope that you continue to grow whilst my story remains stunted. When I was thinking about talking to you, that story kept coming up. It kept reoccurring for me as I was trying to think about, why have I written the book? Why have I chosen the structure that I have chosen? That story kept reoccurring, and at first I couldn't quite place it. And I think the story is trying to tell us something, right? That we've all been colonized. We've all been called to participate in this colonial project. And that as we begin to try and find a way out of this pot, sometimes we are put in competition with each other. And so sometimes we actually trying to trick each other to remain in the hot pot rather than to try and support each other out of that pot and try and find more liberatory ways of living and surviving together. We've been convinced that there's a scarcity of materials, of space, and all those things. And it has been situated in such ways that there's specific spaces that are desirable according to Western standards. And so if we use that, we will find ourselves cooking each other. And so I wanted to share that with you. Now I'd like to quickly transition as quickly as I can to try and give you a little bit more of the structure of how I came. So as I was alluding to that, I wrote this book for for a number of reasons. One was that when I was looking around at the scholarship that is available, I found very limited stories that speak about our experience in the colonial project, right? There are these great stories that sort of like lump all of our stories together and tell us sort of like from either from a very sort of like socio-political sort of like, level, sort of a macro level, like this is what happened over here, but there isn't a nuanced engagement of really conveying that these were bodies, these were peoples, these were families that were fragmented, pitted against each other, removed from lands, placed on other people's lands, created conflict, and then moved again. And so I really wanted to sort of like bring that kind of complexity, right? I think of my ancestors and I think about, the struggles and, the conflicts that have existed and the tensions that have existed between us, but also in trying to understand that, in trying to understand how we exist both in tensions and in solidarity with each other, I began to ask myself, who am I writing this for? And who does this matter to? And so the first sort of positioning to answer that question was that I needed to write this, first of all, to my children, right? So that they know who they are and who they are connected to, so that they begin to understand that home is not something that has been subscribed to and I mean scribed and written to by other people, that it's actually our home and that we can tell our stories. So that was important. And then the second part was I felt this calling that I needed to tell my mother and father's story. I needed to tell our story and not let it be lost in the colonial matrix of stories that emerged there, that I needed to center that story, not in an effort of sort of navel gazing, but in an effort of saying that, there is an importance of putting all of our stories in the context of that encounter, and hopefully to then see also a way beyond that colonial encounter. So that was my motivation, was I wanted to center the voices of my maternal family, I wanted to center the voices of my paternal family, and I wanted to give my kids an entrance point to this. And then I also hoped that it might also speak to the fragmentation of our relations and our relatives who've been fragmented beyond the African continent, right? And so I wanted to say, you know, there is these other stories that also sit with the other stories of chattel slavery, of resistance, of, you know, of making new cultures in new spaces. And I wanted to bring these conversations, these stories into conversation with each other. Now, so in terms of where did I start with all of this? And I think that's an important place, is that before I could even articulate the theoretical framework that I wanted to use to tell these stories, is I was very clear about one thing, is at first I wanted to tell the story of family fragmentation. And I wanted to tell this story, at first I thought, and I think of Bibi Tek's work here, he has the book called A Way to Be Free. And you know, I thought I was telling this story of being abandoned by my mother, right? And that's the story that I thought I was telling at first. And Bibi Tek says to us, just when you feel comfortable, like he says, stories are a double-headed axe. You know, you think they face the other and that they're speaking to the other, but in actual fact, that story may be speaking more to you. And that when you feel comfortable that the story is speaking to you, it may be speaking more to the other. And so I found myself in the space where I was saying, you know, I felt really wronged by my mother. And I was writing the story to say that I actually think that she did not exhibit very good mothering instinct, and was like she had failed as a mother. And so I was writing the son of a I don't know if that's the right term, a scorned son, a hurt son, who was complaining very bitterly about how his mother had failed to raise him and to be there, and had abandoned him. And so that's the story I was telling. And in the process of telling that story, right, there were these annoying other stories that seemed to contradict that very story that I wanted to tell so comfortably. The story of being the victim of my mother's, you know, failing of her motherhood, you know, and people kept giving me these other stories, such as, you know, the joys of motherhood by the great African scholar, feminist scholar, and you know, I was being introduced to folks like Bell Hooks, you know, who were talking about love and everything. And I kept thinking, this is interrupting the story that I had to tell, right? And the story that, you know, for me, I wanted to say, look, you know, here's this woman who's failed. And really what sort of materializes it is that I started to realize is that as I started to read some of these African feminist books, I started to realize that even in my marginal space, I had been called by colonial patriarchy to evaluate the place where I stood, right? So my story, I was narrating it from this privileged masculine position, and I was trying to make a judgment of my mother. And so I'm really thankful for sisters, aunties, who gave me the opportunity to ask in very caring ways, where they gave me books to read. Like they gave me the book by Yvonne Vera, such as Why Don't They Carve Out Other Animals? And it is about the war in Zimbabwe, and it speaks about women's spaces. And it is in that moment of reading these books that a light bulb went on for me. a light bulb that really allowed me to sort of, gave me a new vocabulary to begin to try and hear my mother's story, to begin to say, this fragmentation that happened was not a simple act of my mother choosing to be neglectful, that it was about trying to survive within a colonial space. And those acts of trying to survive, and that in fact, what I found, that as I sort of started to understand these stories of motherhood, understand these stories of women in the African context, not only surviving colonial violence, but surviving, patriarchal violence. So violence also enacted by her own fathers who felt emasculated by the colonial system, right? And so that they then came home and enacted the violence, that they encountered within the colonial structures, that my mother was trying to resist all of this, and at the same time, trying to stay alive in a war zone, and at the same time, trying to raise these babies. And there's a moment that sinks into me, that it sinks in, that I start to realize that the very person that I've been labeling as having failed me, in actual fact, is my hero, right? That the act of actually giving me up. And so then you start to see these parallels, connections that start to materialize, was an act of love to release and to sort of give me up to my father and to say, take care of this child, and then to never see me, was in itself a way of preserving me, one that I could not appreciate until years later when my mother visited me in the orphanage. And I was angry at her, and I was accusing her of having failed me, of having abandoned me. And she didn't try, she didn't try to fight or resist. She just simply said, well, if you really want to know the truth, why don't you come and visit me and talk to me, right? And so my act of going to visit her was not about, let me hear the truth. My act of visiting my mother in Chindambuya, the village, which is, and I have to sort of say, it's a reserve, right? Which you see that it was based on the British system of taking the natives, we put them off, take them off their land, we put them on the reserve system, and then if they become problematic, we move them again to another people's land. And so we keep, causing this instability. And so, of course, our people have been moved many times. And so here she is on this reserve. And when I visited her, I arrived with some cousins, and I learned that my mother actually didn't live with her parents, and we had to travel quite some distance to get to the village which was staying. And when I arrived there, I found that she wasn't actually in a village. She had constructed this home really in a very isolated place. And there she was, this place that didn't have much protection, and she was raising this baby. And it was as if to say, in seeing that, this light bulb came on for me, where I realized that I would have died just like my other siblings if she had not given me up. And where she was, there was no food, there was no running water. She had to travel quite some distance to go get this food. And so I'm going to stop the story there and then go back to the structure of writing. So having seen this, I found myself asking myself the question, how do I tell this story of fragmentation, this story of dislocation, in ways that honor, but yet also bring the pain and the difficulty of those experiences? And so this is when I started really sort of like paying attention to the way we lived, right? Like, so back home in Zimbabwe, there was no such thing as orphanages, right? Orphanages materialized in the 60s. But prior to that, there were orphanages, but they weren't for Black people. They were for interracial kids or white kids, right? And so, like, I think the first orphanage is called, Shelley Cripps orphanage, which, materialized in the early 60s. What is interesting is when somebody loses a family member, in the African context, is your aunt is already your mother. You don't even, we don't call people aunts. You call them either my guru or my nini. So greater mother or lesser mother. That is it. There is babam kulu, babam diki. Greater father, lesser father. But when you go to any of those folks' home, you are at home. So if they were giving gifts to their kids and you show up, guess what? You get a gift, right? And so there's this idea that you are always at home, right? And this idea of taking care of community. Now, that's the positive part. If you got in trouble, though, right, from the beginning of the village, right at the entrance, like if somebody saw you who was related to you, you could also get licks all the way home, and you'd be in trouble and get lectured and everything else. So it also worked, in reverse as well. And I think the point in all of this, for me, started illustrating and capturing this idea of Ubuntu, which is to say, I exist because you exist. And that if we take it to its fullest maximum, is to say, I am an element amongst other elements. My humanity is caught up in yours, and you affirm my existence. And so this philosophical way of thinking, which is very relational in its very foundation, for me became the core for being able to reject colonization, being able to reject oppression, being able to, to reject, racism without losing the ability of recognizing that these are also my relations, right? Because I could not do that. I could not enact that kind of generosity and kindness, not only to my father, but to my mother, and start to see the complexity of colonial encounters that they create. If I couldn't find a framework that was of our making, because of course, right? Because if I had to borrow these ideas from other places, then again, when I'm sharing these stories, there's also this disconnection between, well, what does this really mean for us? Right? And so the idea of Ubuntu as a philosophical framework becomes really important for me because it connects me not only amongst my relations and my family, which sit amongst many nations, but also connects me to the whole continent and begins to give me a new language to begin to, and then allows me also to connect to my relations in the diasporic, but also to my relations beyond the pigmentation of Blackness, right? And to say that I am also connected to these other relations beyond those, right? From an indigeneity perspective, but also from a relational, as Ubuntu says, right? Ubuntu nanga bantu. A person is a person amongst other persons. A being is a being amongst others. An element is an element. So this becomes the framework that allows me to make that move, to be able to reject those behaviors, to be able to problematize those behaviors, to still be able to send our stories, to talk about that, and then to also begin to think about, as we're thinking about this idea of liberation, of decolonizing, of trying to think beyond the colonial encounters and trying to say, what will be our Afro futures beyond these encounters, right? Is that Ubuntu then gives me the framework to begin to think of how might we begin to imagine a future that does not reproduce, right, the impacts and the realities of colonialism. Alisa, can I just check with you, how much time do I have? Because
we have you have like 5 more minutes to speak, okay, and then perfect. We can have like a 10-minute Q&A.
Okay, perfect. So that's the framing and the thinking, and then I also sort of situate things within millet granaries. Now, millet granaries are super important, right? So I started off by sharing with you the story of Uncle hare and baboon who were cooking each other. I think another part of this story is that in those moments, right, if we don't have good granaries, right, we could lose our most important seeds, right? And so when instead of using things like chapters, I use, I situate everything in millet granaries. So here I'm also calling on our recognition and our knowing of what do millet granaries mean to us as African people? What do we put in millet granaries, right? And so I'm saying we put out the very best of our seeds in there, right? And that is what we save, no matter how bad the drought is, we keep it. And we have these cycles, right? We have these cycles of 10-year cycles of, of plentiful, and then 10-year cycles of famine. Now, and maybe I'll spend a little more time here just saying this, right? Part of why Ubuntu is also a great framework for me is that I have the evidence that tells me of how we're connected. So Ubuntu, right, also sort of corrupted as Bantu, is also an identity marker for our people, right, that have been traversing from North Africa all the way to Southern Africa. We've encountered our relatives. We have our relations to our Khoisan and our Khokai relatives. And so we know this. But what we also know is in the Great Lakes, you know what I mean? Like if we go to that East Africa where those Great Lakes are there's also stories that tell us that during these great droughts, people from all over Africa would go there and congregate to that space, right, to be taken care of. And so one of the things we find is all of our names connect us to those people. And so let me give you an example of that. We have names like Banda in Malawi. It's the same name as we get in South Africa as Sibanda, right? We have things like Pili, Firi, right? And when I'm up, all the way up in North Africa, like in Nigeria, and I meet somebody and like our famous sister, Chinamanda Ngozi, right? When I hear a name, I'm like, you are my relatives for sure. Because those names mean something to us, right? And very closely to the same meaning that they have to those names there. So Chinamanda, right, is young woman, right? Coming to womanhood. Right? Ngozi is a great calamity, right? And so you could almost see her name as like, be careful that you don't come to a great calamity, right? Navigate well. And so we understand, so we can hear that name and we are all the way down south, and yet we can see how these names connect us and how they speak to us and remind us of our relational bonds. So that's just by using of names, right? And then of course, philosophically, right, this idea of being relationally connected, I can also find it in the Shona people. It's wunu. We talk about our wunu, and you can also find the same thing. If you go up into Malawi, it's Abantu. Sorry, I'm going back to South Africa, but I need to go to Malawi, so it would be Bantu, right? But it seems the same sort of prefix, the same sort of connotations. So you can see how these ideas, right, when I bring them in, everybody, it hits a corner. So what I'm actually doing is not bringing anything new. I am jogging the people's memory. As I tell my story, I'm starting to jog our relative's story. And I'm starting to say, can you sit back and try to remember not only the period of colonial encounters, what are the stories that we have, right? What are the songs? Because the idea of telling stories around the fire, these are teachings, right? And so there are structures of how we teach. So in my methodology section, I speak a little bit about how we've used orature as a way of teaching. So when we start, we distinguish between telling you a fable and between giving you a teaching. And the distinction is such: when we are saying we're going to prepare you to learn something that is educational, that you may ground you, we say things like "Pairapo," which means, and this too existed many years ago. And the response to that, to convey to me that you are ready for this teaching, is Zefunde. Now, I grew up saying these things, never paying attention to that structure, but Zefunde is very specific. It means I am ready to be taught by you, or we are ready to be taught. So you see, there's this idea of reciprocity and this, there isn't an, consent is also embedded in the teaching, right, of these stories, that, if you don't respond by saying, Zefunde, you are ready to be taught, you are not ready to hear this story, right? And then, we might have a conversation, but this connects to my other works that I've been also doing around some of our mask dances and engagement, which really sort of then sets out to sort of say, how do we then do this in the new context that we find ourselves, where we are now, like, for example, if we take South Africa, they are now, the continent has now ended up in South Africa. So people from multiple spaces and everything. And so sometimes for fear of creating conflict, we become sort of like disconnected from those indigenous ways of teaching. And I'm not so sure that is the best thing for us to do, because then also this accounts, this idea of accountability to the territory, to the place where we're at, it raises some questions. But I also wonder sometimes is that, well, if our languages, right, if the Ngoni language is not completely a made-up language, but it's a new language, right? It's a new language that takes from bits and places and everything else. So when we're speaking as folks from, let's say, Ngoni, those of us in Southern Africa, right, you can hear that we can connect to folks in the Congo, we can speak to folks up there, and there are elements that are in it. So I wonder, is it time for us to begin to create new rituals that bring us together, that we construct in the new spaces between us, right? Because Yvonne Vera also challenges us, right? And I'll conclude with this, sister. She challenges us. She says, we are speaking quite a bit about Ubuntu lately. And she says, we are speaking about it because we realize that we've lost that way of being, right? She says, we've lost that way of being. The colonial encounters has created this idea of individualism that has separated us from community living. At one point, you didn't have to go and ask for sugar from your neighbor because your neighbor was right there, right? You could just literally yell across and they would bring the sugar, you know what I mean? And so there are these spaces that we are losing, and we are recognizing that we are losing a particular way of, philosophizing about the world, but of living in the world. And so there are elements, and I think of Sankofa, there are elements that we want to go and take, but there is also a new space, right, that we find ourselves. And so what do we do in that new space, right? And my worry is that if we don't engage in that new space, colonialism has told us and has demonstrated to us that it'll come and fill it up, whether through religiosity, whether through governance structures, they will fill that space, and we'll find ourselves having to struggle to find our way out of it. I conclude my story over here. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. That was such a beautiful, beautiful talk. And I've read the book, so this is great. This is a reminder for our audience that if you have questions, feel free to unmute yourself, raise your little Zoom hand, or I guess your real hand too, and or leave it in the chat, and I'll get to it. So yeah. But as we wait for questions to roll in, I can start us off with some, or with at least one. Okay, yeah, man, which one do I want to pick? Okay, one thing is that throughout the book, you utilize questions like in a lot of different ways, especially in regards to asking permission from your ancestors and sharing orature. Like, okay, I'm gonna read my favorite quote from the whole book because you're here. Okay. But on page 176, you write to your mother, you write, Amai, if I should be asked how orature, truth-telling, and the act of seeking forgiveness create healing, reestablish familial bonds, revive memory, support understanding, move us beyond anger, give us voice to fight against injustice, bear witness to our survival. And all of this is a question, you guys. Bring hope to our fragmented families and ensure that an evil is not repeated by forgetting about the past. Can I share this orature? So my question is, like, what is the importance of seeking permission, especially in orature and research?
That's a great question, sister. You got me there, sister. I think so much has been done to our people, to us, right? Without consent. The assumption that we couldn't give consent. And, I think of my mother in the context of everything that she's endured, my rejection being one of those, that, I feel the least I could do is to ask her and to try and make space for us to commune, right? One of the things that from an African religious, spiritual practice is that we don't believe that our dead are dead. We believe that they're just in a parallel world, right? And that they are actually with us. And that's why we name our children and, we find ways to honor those spirits. And because they, they have an invested interest, like we stand on their shoulders, right? I am here because they were here, right? Can you see the Ubuntu connection, right? I exist because you exist. And so because they've been here, they have an invested interest in ensuring that, we continue into the future. And so the act of going and turning to them and saying, can you guide me in here? Like, this is my mother. Like, and I've not always been listening, but to say, I am now ready to listen. I'm now open to being guided by your knowledge. And part of that requires me to go back to the fragmented memories that I have and to the stories that I have and begin to piece deliberately together. And so this is as an academic where we bring both the communal knowledge, but also the scholarly work where I can look at what has been, what can I do to help hear my mother in the fullest sense, right? Not in the way I want to hear her. And so that act of sort of saying, could I share this? Is to seek that permission to recognize that, some of these stories, even though they're our stories, they're connected, it is her responsibility to guide and to sort of affirm that story and to say, yes, you've got it right. No, you've missed the mark. And I think part of that is I'm also speaking across multiple communities, multiple peoples. And so by asking and not necessarily making, the colonial maneuver of saying, I am the expert and I know everything, is I'm acknowledging that my memories are fragmented. I know pieces and so of course I gain more knowledge as I speak with my relations, as we share our stories, but it is not the fullest. It's not the full story. And so I'm always ready to be corrected, always ready to be, to say, yes, you've got it right. And I've just found it a good way to move in the world, especially when I'm speaking with folks from home, that it allows for the dialogical engagement, that it's not a one-way conversation.
Thank you so much. That was such a beautiful response. A lot to sit with. I'm definitely at the point where I'm trying to ready myself to have that conversation with my ancestors. But to the chat, we have another question from, well, I should call her Professor. She's in our department. Professor Kathy Ferguson asks or says, "Thank you for your reflections. I am interested in hearing more about stories as double-headed axes. Yeah. How does the manyness of our stories affect the way we use them?
So, I think the thing about, this double-headedness of stories is that it doesn't allow us to create a single, and I think of Chinaman Ngozi again, I think of her and the danger of a single story, right? And she says that when we fall into this, into this idea that there's a single story that we can tell about, our resistance to colonialism, about our impacts, about fragmentation, is, that's where we, especially as a male, I can fall into a very patriarchal kind of way of being and engaging that really doesn't honor relational encounters. And so really what I'm trying to do is leave room, right? To say, I am only telling a section of the story, and that sometimes I'm confident that I'm telling my story, and in actual fact, I'm not telling my story, I'm telling our story, because our stories are nested within each other, right? Like, I cannot begin to tell my story without telling our community stories. I cannot begin to tell our community stories without telling our national story. I cannot begin to tell our national story. Do you see what I'm saying? And so you can see how all these are all nested onto each other. And so they're kind of constantly speaking back, and sometimes they're speaking with, and sometimes they're speaking against, right? And I was reminded of this when I was doing my master's, where I was speaking about the Ngoni community. And I was trying to map out the genealogy of how we ended up in Malawi. And the process of trying to map that out, first of all, it made me realize how many relations I have all over the place. But then secondly, also made me realize that there are multiple peoples that claim these identities, and that these identities, right, like some people have tried to dismiss and say, oh, you are not really part of those people, like you are just, but what I also started to realize that part of these comings and goings and fragmentations of these stories is a reflection of changing times, of conflicts, right, of unions made, and so it's, that they are all true, right? And that when I feel comfortable saying I know our story, then I'm also not listening to the others. And so sometimes one of the books I was reading, not reading, actually one of the stories I was listening to was, I learned that sometimes if you only listen to people who identify as you and the same identities, you miss out a whole bunch of you that can be told from a different vantage point. And so one of the things I've become open to is like, how do we keep opening ourselves up to hearing all those multiple stories of who we are? For example, one of the things I learned about, there's a community amongst the Chewa community. They remember, right? Like, you always think that the victors remember all of their stories about victors, but there are stories that they don't know, or they've forgotten for particular reasons, where it's remembered quite vividly by those who were defeated by them in war, right? And so they have this memory of this particular story that they can tell you in vivid ways. And when I was listening to it, I was like, and then I'd go, and then somebody would sort of say, "Oh yeah, I vaguely kind of remember that," and so I guess the point being for me is, I'm never comfortable just believing that, oh, this is our story and this is the way it is. I'm constantly looking at, well, who else is the story speaking to, and who is missing from this story, who has been silenced by this story, and what might they have to say? Because again, I go back to that Ubuntu philosophy, right? Is that I really fundamentally believe that I am because you exist, right? And so we're inseparable, right? I hope that answers it.
Mahalo. Okay, we got more questions. So yeah, Sara. And I'm sorry, I always mispronounce your name, but yes, Sara.
No, Sara is perfect. Thank you so much. I've really appreciated your talk, and I loved how you articulated that consent is embedded in teaching, in particular in that call to response. I'm curious about what you also think about the role of seeking consent from what's participating in the teaching. So I'm thinking of the fire that creates the warmth, the wood logs that create the fire, the physical location that creates the space to learn and share. In Karjala, we have articulated a particular responsibility to obtain forest consent before we enter into them. But what we haven't yet articulated, I think, is the role of consent for the other entities besides humans that participate in that teaching process. So I would be really curious to kind of hear your thoughts on how you may have already articulated that or what that makes you think of, because I really love how beautifully you articulated it there from a person to a person.
So actually, so thank you Sarah, for the question. And actually, that is actually well articulated in Ubuntu, in the sense that, and I'll give you a story as an illustration. When I was when I was a young boy, when we were going out to play, there was specific forests that we would get to, and we would all get to the edge of the forest, and before we entered that forest, we would crouch, right, and we would ask for permission, right. And so whilst we were in that space, we would so I guess the point I'm making is that in Ubuntu, we recognize the intelligence of nature, right? Like, this is not a new phenomenon, and it's not well illustrated, sort of in the song that I sort of, but part of that is that we actually believe that we used to commune with animals. We used to commune with certain spaces, and they're sacred spaces, even to this day, on the continent, that we go to commune not only with our ancestors, but we also go to commune with those spaces because we see those spaces as holding sacred knowledges, right? And so how do we know that? Well, part of our language is an encoding between our experience and our encounters and our, and this idea of reciprocal relation and accountability it's embedded within that language, and that there's certain words that we have that actually honor that, and some words that actually that are made because of an encounter with nature. They actually have no meaning outside of that relationship. And so, here's the story that, so just to go back to the story I was telling you about where at that forest. When I came to that, at first I was like, yeah, I totally get this. We're being respectful and everything else. And then we went a little bit further, and I found, I don't know the word for this in English, but it's called a mjanje, which is like, I think sort of like a more derogative, it's called a monkey orange. And it's like, oh, and so we had found one of these whilst we were in the forest, and I cracked mine and there was worms in it. And I remember going, yeah, this is rotten, and throwing it down, and all the other kids went, right? They were shocked, and they were like, how dare you be so disrespectful? If you find something that you can't eat and that the other relatives are eating, you just simply put it down and you continue, because you don't want to offend, the spirit of the forest. And I thought, okay, you know what? I've handled as much as I can handle. We did the, ceremony to come in, and now you guys are taking a little bit too far. And so I refused to apologize or anything else. And we were like trying to find our way back. And as we were trying to walk back, nobody could seem to find the path. There were many paths that we could see, and we were on a hill. So theoretically, it sounded like it would be almost impossible to get lost, but we couldn't find our way out. We'd climb up on the tree, we would see the path, and we would say, okay, let's walk down over there. And it wasn't until where I, became a little scared, and I thought, okay, maybe I should consider reevaluating my position here. And so I crouched and I asked for forgiveness, and I said, look, I did this really out of belligerent behavior, and so I want to apologize, ancestors, and and seek you that you give me, you allow us to return. When we arrived back, everybody in the village knew we had been lost. And everybody said, so what have you learned? I'll stop there.
Mahalo. Okay, we have time for one more question, and it is from Kumunoinoi Silva. She asks, or says, the title of your book includes Decolonizing Black Masculinities.
Mm-hmm.
Would it be possible for you to summarize this aspect of the book?
Mm-hmm. So, absolutely. I think that's a great question. I think one of the things that I sort of came to realize from a very young age, both in the orphanage and also in living, in North America, was that the experience of colonialism necessitated sort of a hyper masculinity that I had to demonstrate, right? And that hyper masculinity required me to perform a particular guise, right? So for me, I had to play a tough guise. And so one of the things I did was I played rugby, I went into boxing, in the orphanage, we had our own little gang that we sort of formed. And part of that was that it was like, please don't mess with me, right? Like, but in the act of doing that, it also then became like, I was also learning that colonialism was teaching me that, right, when you exercise this kind of patriarchal sort of masculinity, you can take whatever you want as long as you can do it through violence, right? And so for me, that became a way of sort of like engaging. Yet, and this is the thing, right? I clearly understood that I was at the margin of that, right? Like my Blackness did not allow me to completely have the privilege of that white masculinity. And I think folks in disability scholars understand this very clearly, right? Like you can be white and for that whiteness to be a certain pass, but if you have a disability, then it kind of critiques that whiteness as being a useless whiteness, right? And I think the same kind of is being critiqued against, white women as well. And so then, of course, then you see that at this, right, this creates a hierarchiness of being, right? And in my experience, right, was at the bottom of that was Black women, right? And so this kind of inverted the things that we know. And I want to sort of like play with this in terms of that even in our patriarchal societies, versus our matriarchal societies, there was a fundamental respect that we had for our women that got lost, right? And it has gotten lost over multiple years. Like, people, when we think about colonization, most people always think about missionary colonization, but we actually forget that it was way before that. The arrival of Christianity came way earlier. Islam was in there way earlier, right? And so you start to see the movement of Ubuntu people was to try and get away from those, from that kind of violence and that kind of embodiment of a toxic kind of masculinity. But in our act of moving away, we became militarized. And, and that act of becoming militarized then also then put us in the cycle of where we were starting to enact the very violence that we were running away from, right, on other peoples. And so what I guess the title of this, of like sort of like decolonizing masculinity, is really trying to come into contact with our femininity, right? Is that I'm also calling to say that there is no such thing as masculinities without femininity, right? And so I could sit and give a whole lecture on that and how that's supported by Ubuntu and our philosophies around that. But that is the fundamental starting place, right? And if you ask any African, what is the first words that you do when we're distressed and everything else, when you're crying, when you're upset? We cry, we say, Amai, Amai. We call to our mother, right? And that is a call not only to our physical mother, but to our spiritual mother. There is also a call to our feminine self, right? And so the position, and I think if I take, also a guide from the work of of the elder Credo Vuswamutwa, who spoke actually that even in the patriarchal societies as we understand them, that when we go back in time, we actually find that they were actually governed by a council of elder grandmothers, right? Which is very consistent when we think about our older communities, right? Like the older Bantu communities are all matriarchal, governed by council of women, right? And so when you start to do the research, right, and we can even go back 5,000 years, if we go to Egypt to use that as well, we find the same kinds of evidence. So really the idea of taking up a patriarchal idea of governance and leadership, that comes through movement, through migration and the act of war, right? And creating militarization to try and resist it. And so, but we know these things, right? We have the knowledge of all of this. And so really, like I said, I'm only trying to jog our memories to start to say, if we spend the time to investigate, to talk to each other, we get a fuller picture. I could say a little bit more about that, but I think, I hope that captures the essence.
That was so beautiful. There's so many things we could, I wish this was a lot longer session, but yeah. I just want to thank you, Devi, for coming and sharing your knowledge with us today. You know, your work, it really evokes the Pilipili aspect or relational aspect of the ʻāina Pilipili. But now I'll hand things off over to Kamakana. But thank you so much.
Thank you, Sisi.
Yes, mahalo, Brother Devi, Dr. Mucina, for joining us. And it's just, wow, really speaks to definitely what Alyssa was talking about, Pilipili relationship. That's that foundation for all of us. Mahalo again to everyone. Mahalo for the great discussion, the great questions. Mahalo, Alyssa, for being our moderator. Awesome job. I loved your first question. And of course, mahalo for everyone attending today's speaker series. This presentation will be publicly available, and you folks will all receive a link once it's up on YouTube. So again, mahalo for attending, and have a great rest of your day. Aloha.
Mahalo.
Thank you.